of real Atheology. I can't remember when you guys started, but it's been a couple of years now. So that's like one of those channels where I'm not cringing, every time I say, "Oh wow, this is some pretty good stuff here."
I do appreciate it. Yeah, well, that's what we're trying to avoid is the cringe. So we, Justin Schieber and I started the project years ago because we were really into the philosophy of religion, and we kept trying to dig around for little nuggets of philosophy of religion, and everything we were digging into was just cringe. We're hoping to provide that alternative outlet, something like the secular outpost, or what Joe Schmid's now doing with the Majesty of Reason, to just give a corner of the great debate some philosophical depth to it, instead of just the new atheist rhetoric, and you know what I'm talking about.
For sure, yeah. I think you guys have succeeded. I really appreciate your work. So I speak as someone who disagrees with the worldviews presented, but I think you guys are extremely articulate, and it's not just rhetorical strategies that are being flourished. So yeah, good stuff. Well, so are we recording at this point, Chase?
Yep, recording's going.
Cool. Okay. I don't know how you want to get into this. I sort of went back and listened to some of your stuff on morality. You had a recent podcast, I think, on irreducible normativity. Yeah, talking with a fellow atheist. He was not, I think, very familiar with that view, and you were getting it across.
Corey Markham, I think, if memory serves me right, it was Corey
That's
Markham.
correct. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I could give a quick construction what I think your view is, or if you prefer, I would be happy to give you the reins and let you maybe present it, and then
I'll just go. Yeah, why don't I just go ahead and just lay it out real quick?
Please do.
The minute or 2 minute spiel.
Go for it.
My view in the literature, you can Google it up, is what's called ethical non-naturalism. And so this view maintains that some things matter in a moral sense because cognitivism is true. There are moral sentences that can be true or false. Some form of realism, I believe, is true. So some moral sentences are true. They aren't all systematically false. And I believe that moral sentences are made true by properties other than the attitudes or responses of subjects. In other words, subjective characteristics. So I'm an objectivist when it comes to moral truths. And the claim that makes my view uniquely the ethical non-naturalist view is the claim that moral properties are not identical to any set of non-normative properties. So this is where Hegel would come in, where I would say, look, we can't use a reductionistic method to understand moral truths. We have to instead have a holistic approach to it. And so I think that what really matters is reasons. So I think that we all have normative reasons to avoid pain. I think we have obligations not to contradict ourselves. I think we have decisive reasons to accept the conclusions of sound arguments. And I think that someone's suffering counts in favor of us trying to do something about it. And so that's kind of the bare bones of the view. That's the material that you would use to then construct a moral meta-ethic, a view of what is uniquely moral. And so that's where we get the concept of a moral reason. And so I think some things matter in a moral sense because there are reasons for everyone to care about them. And some reasons are also moral reasons because they are stronger than any other competing reasons we may have. And so in apologetic circles, a distinction is often drawn between moral values and moral duties. So to try to help characterize my view within that language game, we could say that there are moral values like justice that require us to treat similar cases alike. Prudence would be another moral value, so we should have equal concern for all parts of our lives. And benevolence would be a moral value. It would require us to treat the good of any other as much as their own. And then to characterize something like a moral responsibility, we could say that an act is morally wrong or we are morally blameworthy if some act would be disallowed by a principle that would make things go impartially best, or a principle that everyone could rationally will, or a principle that no one could reasonably reject. And so those would just be the common principle, the familiar principles of common morality. So things like we all have reason not to steal, we all have reason to tell the truth, we all have reason to keep our promises, we all have reasons to minimize suffering so far as we can. So these would be the kinds of principles that would ground, to use the apologetics language, that would ground the moral responsibilities or moral obligations. And so this view can often get confused. Let me say one more thing so to help head off any potential confusion. My view is called ethical non-naturalism. And so that's very unfortunate in the philosophy of religion when the term naturalism has a completely different meaning than it does in ethics. And so when I say that I'm an ethical non-naturalist, I don't mean that I'm not a metaphysical naturalist. I mean that I avoid what's called the naturalistic fallacy. The naturalistic fallacy we get from G.E. Moore. And so when we characterize a moral truth, we're given neither a causal nor empirical description of it. When we characterize justifications of how we think and how to act, we do it in the logical space of reasons. And the idea that morality is analyzable without remainder into non-normative facts is a radical mistake. Attempts to reduce the logical space of reasons to what I'll call the logical space of causes will commit the naturalistic fallacy. And so if we were to say, a good example of this is trying to derive a moral conclusion from purely non-moral premises. So if we were to say, homosexuality occurs in nature, therefore homosexuality is good or morally permissible, we've committed the naturalistic fallacy. Because the fact that homosexuality may occur in nature is itself not a moral fact. A moral fact would be homosexuality has some property that is either good or bad. So you could say, the moral claim would be homosexuality is morally permissible. And then you would have to use, moral philosophy to argue that. Or you could argue the contrary and say that homosexuality is morally impermissible. And then you would have to argue for that, and you would appeal to more and more basic moral facts, not natural facts, moral facts. And so we cannot understand our actions in the world and their moral worth purely within what I've called the logical space of causes, the natural domain. We need these other kinds of facts that are not about the natural world. So these are normative facts, mathematical facts, modal facts, logical facts. These are all facts that we cannot use a reductive method to understand. So in that sense, I'm an ethical non-naturalist. I think that probably gives a good overview of the view of my view.
Great. Okay. So I have maybe 5 or so objections that I'd love to go over with you and maybe see how you interact with them. But I don't want to jump the gun in case you're interested in maybe exploring some of my positions on these things. As a Christian, I obviously disagree with Moore's, what I take to be his outlook on the guillotine dilemma. So it seems to me that from my position that there really isn't any difficulty faced by a Christian in bridging the is-ought gap. There isn't any difficulty in deriving obligations from special descriptions about certain affairs that God has set up. But so I'm not cutting you off. If you want to investigate that,
I think now would be a good time for you to lay out some of your views. Then
okay.
That way we have them both on the table.
Sure. Cool. Okay. So I'm not picking this up from reading any specific philosopher, but my view maybe cuts somewhere in between a natural law theory and a divine command theory, and I'll explain what I mean by that towards the end of this summary. But what I would say is that I think to understand my view of morality, you first have to understand the difference between God's good and humanity's good. On a Christian scheme of meta-ethics, God possesses goodness in and of himself. And maybe one way we can explain this is by saying that God is Trinity. God is three persons in one God. And so he eternally experiences communion in and of himself. He possesses love. Each member of the Trinity is timelessly enjoying adoration of each other. They fulfill each other. They are, as members of one God, in harmony. And so that beauty and glory is God's original goodness. And when God creates the world, he seeks to reflect his original beauty in various ways. One of those ways is, to borrow some of Ben's language, perhaps in a moral domain. There's the realm of reasons and norms and values. And these are instruments by which agents that God has designed in his image can reflect his original beauty. So on a Christian scheme, there's two fundamental types of goods. They're related, but they're not metaphysically identical. There's God's original capital G good, and there's humanity's lowercase g good, which is a reflection of the original. And what it means for a human to be good or bad is for them to interact with God in terms of the norms that he set up in certain ways. And so what I would say is that from my point of view, there's sort of a three-pronged, or there's sort of three nodes that come together to make this moral system work. There is the nature of God, there's the nature of man, and then there's the institution or law that God has set up that brings the two in communion, that makes it so that when human beings act in the world, there is always a domain of morality to that action. Whatever man does is for or against God. Whatever man thinks is yes or no to his creator. So to me, in that system, it's really not difficult to say that moral facts like you should not murder can be cashed out in more fundamental descriptive terms, because it is exactly this description I've given, wherein God legislates moral facts in the universe and moral agents capable of being the audience of those facts that entail obligations for those agents. In a very simplistic way, God has said, "Thou shalt not murder." And that, unlike divine command theory, that's not to say you can reduce these moral facts to commands, but it is to say that God's commands always convey moral facts that he himself has legislated. So like divine command theory, even though his commands aren't identical to or aren't the thing to which moral facts reduce, nevertheless, God and his creatorhood, the way he formats or designs the whole setting in which we participate, is a sufficient condition for moral facts. He is a sufficient ground. And like NLT, like natural law theory, the nature of man is essential to this moral system. It simply there's nothing to which these moral facts pertain if there are no human agents made in God's image to reflect his original beauty in their beauteous and glorious actions.
So, just for clarity, would it be fair to say that even on your view, even though we cannot reduce something like moral obligations to God's commands, morality would still consist in some necessary fashion of divine commands? Divine commands would still be a necessary part of morality, even if we couldn't reduce certain, basic moral facts to his commands. That's how I'm trying to understand it.
No problem. Yeah, no problem. So speaking very strictly, I don't think they are metaphysically necessary. In other words, I don't think I don't think they are necessary to metaethics. God does not need to verbally command something in order for that something to be obligatory. Rather, I think they are epistemologically necessary. So I think what God's commands do is tell us imperatively what things he's legislated, but they aren't themselves the legislation. So I think the connection is that, like, when you read Exodus, the law there is doing two things. It is setting up a covenant. So it's setting up a contract with the people of Israel, to use modern terminology. And in terms of that contract, these people of Israel are obliged to certain terms and services that God has set up. And those terms and services are communicated in terms of the commands that you see. Thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal. And that sort of reasoning that I'm doing about Exodus is the same reasoning that I'm doing about man on a cosmic scale. I'm saying, look, man is born into a covenant with God. Man is always a contracted creature from day one, from life's first breath till final death. Man is in covenant with God, and therefore has these terms and services that just constitute part of what it means to be a human being.
Okay. So would it also be fair, just one more, so God's commands here are doing more epistemological work than they generally would from the ontological formulations of, say, divine command theory, where certain people would say, look, God's commands provide the ontological foundation. So you would be less towards that move and more towards what, like, God's commands also constitute an epistemological understanding of how we come to how we come to know moral truths. Is that fair?
I think that's accurate. Yeah, I think I might even put it a little more strongly that the primary function of the commands is epistemological. That's almost entirely what they're doing.
Gotcha. Oh, all right. So from here, let me go ahead and so there was in laying it out the two worries that I have right off the bat. Is the first is this? I laid out my view. I built it all on the concept of a moral reason, and so you have built it on the concept of the nature of God, the nature of man, and the legislation that God has, the divine legislation that exists between God and man. You see this simplicity as a worry for your view, where my view only has to appeal to one essential normative concept. It sounds like you need at least three concepts to start building an ethical theory. Is that something that it would worry me? I mean, that's why I'm putting it towards you.
Yeah. I guess I don't think so. I don't want to jump the gun, but one of my counter concerns is exactly that. I think when we take away one of these three pieces, we're going to see immediately some problems strike up. So I think just to sort of preview things, like I think you're going to have a problem with some kind of fatalism on the one hand if you take away the human nature part of the equation that I set up. And I think if you take the God part out of the picture, then you're going to have a really hard problem identifying exactly what goodness is. I think that's I think that's the same kind of emptiness objection that you might give to a moral Platonist.
Okay. And then the second worry was this idea of God is the primary good, and all other goods reflect his goodness. There's this reflecting relation that's somewhat a little unclear to me, because it seems to imply that God is the only thing of intrinsic value, that everything else is only extrinsically valuable. It is only valuable in relation to God, which to me seems implausible, because I think things like truth, love are intrinsically valuable. They're things that are valuable in and of themselves. And so we don't need to make reference to anything else for them to be valuable. So does your view imply that there just are no intrinsic goods other than God?
So if we're defining intrinsic, if we're defining intrinsic and extrinsic in a way such that, something is extrinsically valuable just in case it derives its value from something else, then I would concede that, yeah, I think that God is the only intrinsic value. It seems to me that I guess I would have a differing view about truth as well. The creature-creator distinction that I made with respect to metaethics is one that I would make even with respect to, say, metaphysics of logic, or a theory of truth, or something like that. I don't think that God's truth is metaphysically identical to the property truth that we talk about when we're talking about propositions or something like that. So my approach is maybe more radical than most. I think you're going to run into more divine conceptualists and DCT proponents in these apologetic conversations, but maybe in defense of those Christians, I would say it seems to me that one strategy, one I wouldn't personally take, is that you can deposit truth in God. And so you can say, well, the metaphysics of truth is that originally it belongs to God and it has something to do with God, so that the intrinsic value of truth is exactly consistent with this view, because truth is exemplified in God first, and then every other truth is a reflection of that original.
Gotcha. I said all these questions because, again, to clarify for anyone listening, my view doesn't rule out God. There is nothing about my view that says God does not exist. In fact, I would say that that the concept of God presupposes my view because of the theologically important claim God is morally perfect, or morally good, or perfectly good, or however we want to cash it out. And so, in my view, there is no distinction between God's truth and man's truth. There is no distinction between man's goodness and God's goodness. Now, they might be exemplified in different ways, but there's still just one truth, and there's still just one goodness. That makes sense? So that when I started this off, I was like, does this simplicity worry you? Because the advantage that I think my view has a priori here is its simplicity. It's just the bare, I don't have to make the concession that there's only one thing of intrinsic value. You say that there's a plurality of things that are of intrinsic value, and I don't have to make these distinctions. I don't have to introduce these three parts that you did, God's nature, man's nature, and then the divine legislation that exists between them. Now that we have more of a more full picture, I'd like to give you the opportunity to come back to that original object of simplicity, because I know that you said that if we deviate from your view, we'll run into things like fatalism. Would you still go that route? Would you say, look, these are just the necessary pieces, and anytime we try to deviate from them, we're just going to run into insoluble problems?
Yeah, I think towards the simplicity concern, I would say two things. I would concede the way you just put it. I think that's exactly right. That we're really going to end up in something of a transcendental criticism of each other's views. That, look, I treat this as just the kind of conceptual framework that you have to work in to intelligibly talk about morality, and as soon as you step outside of that, are the very things that we're trying to refer to with moral sentences just don't find any purchase. The stuff starts to fall apart.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So, but I would also say that I think there's a correlated problem with something like parsimony, that the way you determine parsimony is somewhat subject to your own worldview. It's somewhat subject to your own epistemological pre-commitments. And so we might not share the same pre-commitments about what makes something truly simple. So I won't press that concern. If you disagree, that's fine. But I'll just say that maybe another time we might want to talk about epistemology or something if you're interested. And I think, yeah. So I think the issue there is like, well, is it really less simple or not? It seems like that might be open to a challenge.
Oh. Sorry about that. Shoot off a cat.
Oh no.
For whatever reason, they love to just try to sit on the keyboard of the laptop.
Oh yeah, there's one that's always trying to get in my room. I feel bad whenever I have to make her get out.
Okay, so do we from here? Do we would just want to then? I think now's a good place to the back and forth of what we think are the advantages of our view. So now we've set up that it's obviously going to be as you said, a transcendental sort of disagreement where we say, okay, look, these are the problems that your view is going to run into, and these are the problems that my view is going to run into, and then try to parse them out. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's
where we want to go from there. Sweet.
Yeah.
So the first thing that comes to my mind is the theologically important claim that I mentioned earlier that God is perfectly good. And so I take that as a theologically important claim, that we can't sacrifice that claim if we're going to be perfect being theists. And I also take that claim to be stating a substantive moral fact. It's not something trivial, it's something substantive. We are saying something about God's actions, his character, his moral value. We are saying something about our potentially our obligations of worship to him. But if we're going to reduce in one way God's goodness to God's nature, if God's nature is the paradigm of goodness, we aren't actually stating a moral fact now about God when we say God is good. We're just saying God is identical to his nature, which is just a trivial claim. And then it also raises the further issue of, well, then what grounds, what constrains God's nature? What are the moral obligations that constrain God's nature such that he couldn't be hateful? Why is God loving rather than hateful? Is there something that morally constrains that nature? So I don't think that, I think this view is going to run into problems of, one, making the theologically essential claim God is good substantive, and then it's going to have an additional problem of grounding what constrains God's nature. What is it that makes God's nature morally relevant such that his nature is loving rather than hateful? Why is, right now on the view, it seems that, there would be no moral difference between a loving God and a hateful God. Because on your view, it's just whatever God's nature is becomes the paradigm of moral goodness. Does that help characterize the worry?
I think so. So, I mean, just interrupt me and tell me that I've completely misunderstood you, but this sounds very similar to something like a Euthyphro dilemma, that, on the one hand, you can ask the question, are moral facts, and in this case, we're using the example of moral ascriptions about God. When we say that God is good, for example, are those moral facts because God says so? In which case, there seems to be some kind of arbitrariness there, or is God saying there are moral facts because he sees that they're already there? There are these moral facts that inform his beliefs about them and count as reasons, I think you would say, to make those judgments. Is that like a fair?
So I would say it is certainly related to the Euthyphro dilemma. We could use Euthyphro dilemma as a tool to help us understand this worry. But the worry can be articulated without using the Euthyphro dilemma. For example, the idea that we're worried about God is good being a substantive claim, this is this is also related to Hume's is-ought distinction and G.E. Moore's open question argument. Say, how do these things state substantive facts? And then there's the standing objection to divine command theory of what grounds God's moral obligations. Is it another command? Because if it's another, what grounds that command? Is it another command again? And then you have an infinite regress of grounding commands. So certainly the Euthyphro dilemma is related, because we can ask, just like you said, what is the moral difference between a loving God and a hateful God? Is it because God says so, or is it just there's some reason independent of God that makes it the case that there's a moral difference there? Certainly, we can use the Euthyphro dilemma to help us drive issue here, but I think the issue goes beyond the Euthyphro dilemma. We don't necessarily need to invoke the Euthyphro dilemma in order to raise this worry.
Okay, yeah, well, so it seems to me, let me set up how I think these questions could be answered, and then I'll give my answer. So toward the emptiness or vacuity question, what does it mean really? How does it cash out when we say God is good? It seems to me that all I need to do to answer that sort of question is just to give some straightforward answer about what I'm referring to or what I'm talking about when I talk about God's goodness, to give some kind of answer that doesn't just count as a synonym or something of, God is good. And it seems that I've already done that. My answer is that God is Trinity. And so in and of himself, God experiences love. He experiences communion. He possesses in himself a life that is not subject to time or change. And it seems to me that from that, there is an expectation that when God wishes to share that goodness to creatures that can witness reflections of it, or that can experience things that resemble that original communion, his way of doing so would involve the things we call love and interaction, relationships, these sort of social realities that we talk about. So that seems to me to, that's by no means a philosophical article worthy answer to the problem, but it does give you a brief overview of, I think there's this idea of how God in himself has these virtues that are just original exemplifications on the basis which these reflections that we normally call good in everyday human affairs can be grounded. And then toward the question, what would motivate or count as reasons for God commanding or prohibiting certain behaviors or certain attitudes or whatever, I think there again, I kind of previewed that in my answer, that I think, God is Trinity. So we would expect his laws, which are aimed at giving creatures a means to experience his original triune beauty, to witness it and to have some way of reflecting that in themselves. So it's going to have to be communal. It's going to be on the basis of love. There is a certain other centricness to God's knowledge that's going to be a basis for being compassionate towards others, so on and so forth. So it seems to me that that's a very straightforward way of answering those questions.
Okay, so I've put quite a bit on the table. We've gone from everything from the Euthyphro to the is-ought to the open question. So how about you put forward an objection now?
Okay, yeah. So I think actually this is exactly the kind of objection that I would raise against you, Ben. So it seems to me that when you talk about reasons and you talk about moral norms, by way of analogy, it seems that you're sort of handing us a rule book. You have sort of this list of rules, but there's no way to account for how the rule book itself as a whole is good or obligatory. So we might think of this as a sort of metaphysical problem where you have all these particular instances that you identify as good or as values or as norms. But then we can ask the question, well, what are they instancing? What is that? What exactly is it that unifies all of these particulars? And it seems to me that the very motivation for taking an ethical non-naturalist position is that there's no answer to that question. But that seems to me to leave you in a very bad epistemological state, because then really when we say it is good not to cause needless suffering, that's really indistinguishable from saying it's schmud or it's bibbidi bobbidi boo not to cause needless suffering. Since, I mean, all we're doing is taking a word and classifying certain instances of behavior under that word, where that word doesn't really refer to anything substantive.
So I think you're right to point out that an implication of the ethical non-naturalist view is that something like goodness, something like a primitive moral concept is going to, in essence, be indefinable. In the sense that we're not able to define it without making reference to an irreducibly normative concept. So what we need is a concept that unites all of these things. And so that's what I try to do with the concept of a normative reason. So, and a normative reason is a consideration that counts in favor. Counts in favor roughly means gives a reason for. So, because of the indefinability of my view, I can't explain this concept merely by using words. So how you would, try to characterize what goodness is using words about God, I don't think that can be done. I think what we have to, the way we explain these concepts is to get people to use them. And so when I say that the nature of what it's like to be burnt or whipped gives us all reason to want to avoid those kinds of experiences, I'm saying something about the nature of being burnt or whipped, the nature of pain. I'm saying that it itself, in order to understand pain holistically, you have to understand that it has this property of counting in favor of our responding to it in some way. Similar claims would apply to love. So pain would be something that would have the property of counting in favor of us responding to it negatively, whereas love would be something that would count in favor of us responding to it positively. So I think this concept of a reason also helps us in the epistemic domain, which is where you seemed also to bring up a worry. So just like I think that there are things in the world that can count in favor of our responding to them in some ways, or in acting in certain ways, I think there are things in the world that count in favor of our believing certain things. So I believe that the fossil record has the property of counting in favor of biological evolution. But I don't have to go dig around fossil record for this property of counting in favor of biological theory. That's something that the fossil record has in and of itself. So again, we'd have to understand holistically the fossil record in order to get to the conclusion that we should believe that biological evolution is true. It's what makes it the case that we should believe that theory. And so you raise a very important epistemological question of, well, then how do we come to knowledge of these basic moral truths, these things that we can't define in other terms, that we have to use these concepts in order to understand them? This is where Hegel is going to be very, very influential into my thought, because I think it's a dialectical process. I think it's a historical process of moral argument. I think as we go through this dialectical process, we become more acquainted in and for itself moral truth of reality. And this is how we make moral progress. So it used to be the case that we thought slavery was morally permissible. Through the historical process of moral argument and dialectical, we have come to the realization of the basic moral truth that it is immoral, or it counts in owning other people. The act of owning another person has this property of counting in favor of us not doing that. That's something that's categorically wrong. We've made moral progress in this way. I'm not going to be able to give a straightforward understanding how we come to knowledge of these moral truths by just appealing to my five senses. I'm going to have to appeal to this much larger holistic dialectic that is going on through time that we all participate in as a dialectical, as a conversation, as doing moral philosophy like we're doing right now. We are part of that process, and by trying to understand concepts in themselves like we're doing right now, like you laid out your view, trying to understand something in itself, and then thinking of objections to that view, understanding a view out of itself, and then help us reach the truth in and for itself. Now, this is Hegelian, and the tool that's often used to help us understand this comes from Fichte, and it's some people might be familiar with it. It's thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Granted, that's a very, very rough, simplistic way of thinking of Hegelian dialectics, but it does help us see that's what we're trying to do. That's how we're coming to a knowledge of these truths through philosophy. But this again has another huge implication, another feature of my view that's very unique, in that I don't think moral properties are discoverable by the natural sciences. There isn't some natural experiment or test in the natural world that's going to settle moral disagreements. So it might be a question of the natural sciences as to whether or not we can extend human life hundreds of years into the future. There's no experiment or natural theory that's going to help us decide whether we should, ought, or must extend lives. That's a moral question. That's something that we're going to have to do moral philosophy, and we're going to need to use resources that not only the natural sciences presuppose, but that the natural sciences themselves are just not going to be able to get at through the methods of experimentation, observation. I don't like to use the term falsification, but those are scientific methods. That's just not the method that we're going to use to discover moral truth, just like it's not the type of method we would use to discover mathematical truths or logical truths or even modal truths. Modal truths being about what is possible or what is necessary or what is contingent. This is where we're in the realm of pure philosophy. I'm sure I rambled there for a while. I apologize, but
No, it's totally. I mean, I've never done that before, so no, I'm just kidding. Yeah, no, I'm terrible about that. So, I'll say a couple things. First of all, you have to humor me because there's no way. You have to humor me because there's no way for me to cover everything there. And there's a lot of agreement in funny places. Like I am fond of the way that you connect epistemic norms to moral norms. That I am very fond of. I think that's something that naturalists in the philosophy of religion sense of the word have a big problem with. And I don't think that the same type of objection, maybe related objections, but not the same type of objections.
We found a lot of common ground. So like the variation of metaphysical naturalist that I am is not a reductive one. I think reductive naturalists certainly suffer from what you're just trying to I believe the in the literature it's called naturalized epistemology, and I think that runs into problems.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's hugely problematic. Yeah. So, but I think I just want to press you a bit on whether there's an answer looking there in what you went over. It seems to me that this problem has epistemological consequences, and there's a big lurking objection that's almost like the counterpart of the one I'm giving right now. But I want to say that this objection is really a metaphysical objection. It's really a concern that goes back to Plato, and maybe you want to interrupt and give your response when I give this analogy, but just for the sake of the listeners, one of the objections that's brought up against Plato is that when you consider these abstracta, when you consider something like the form of a tree, that's supposed to be this perfect vision, if you will, of what all trees are, and they are mere participant reflections of this original tree. One of the big problems is that for Plato, it's pure abstracta. It's pure form. There is no particularity to the form of the tree. So it doesn't have 7 branches. It's not 6 feet tall. You can't touch its roots. It doesn't have bark. It has nothing about it that would connect it conceptually to a tree. It has no, and for that very reason, it has no explanatory power. It just has nothing to do with the tree. In fact, you can't say anything particular about it because that would just be to attribute particularity to mere abstracta. And I think, Ben, your position runs into exactly the same problem, that you can give these lists, again, something like a rule book that I can look into and I can read every page and see that you have all these rules. But then the question can be asked, okay, what's the significance of the rule book? And why should I take Ben's rule book over Muhammad's or the next guy who comes along? Why should I think any of them aren't really just talking about their preferences rather than actually speaking about something that is extramental? And I think there just is no answer to that, because even when you say something like, the unifying concept is a motivating norm, or that might be redundant for you, but a reason to act, or something in favor of an attitude or behavior or something. The issue then is, well, what is that? Right? Well, what exactly are we talking about when we talk about these norms? Right? What exactly is, if as soon as we go to answer that question, presumably we're going to get just a bigger list of norms. Right now, we're just getting the list of moral norms and epistemic norms and these other properties of what we consider good and evil. But we still haven't answered the question, what is good? What is normativity itself? And so I see here lurking a very big problem of vacuity to the words. Just to be clear for the listeners, Ben, I think, on many issues has very virtuous opinions about these things, opinions I would agree with. I just don't think those are consistent with ethical non-naturalism.
That's fair. So to answer to just start off where you last left off, the problem that you say, just characterizing what goodness is, and that's a problem from my view. And so I would just admit that. I would just bite the bullet on that, because I would say, look, goodness is indefinable. It is a feature of my view. It is a defining feature of my view that that goodness is a primitive concept. So it would be like a concept like consciousness or time. It's a type of property that we cannot get behind, so to speak, in order to understand it in terms of something simpler, because there isn't something simpler to it. It is primitive in that sense. And so I'm in the spirit of admitting objections to my view. I think there are two standing objections to my view. The two objections that I have to constantly be thinking about. And so the first is the argument from queerness. And it's basically that these primitive properties that I'm referring to just seem too queer to be part of the universe. They just seem too strange and too weird from everything else that we're familiar with. How do these things fit into the furniture of reality? Well, if we frame that objection in non-reductive terms, if we're not using a reductive method, I don't think that objection carries much force, because there's plenty of things that seem queer, things like logical truths, mathematical truths, modal truths, a possible world where, certain things have those things also seem queer, but they're integral to how we understand. So don't give too much credit to that objection. The second one is, I think, the more important one, and it's certainly the one you've been pressing more. It's the epistemological objection. How do we have knowledge of these indefinable properties? And so I tried to lay out a little bit of the Hegelian dialectic process of how we come to knowledge of these sorts of things. And so with Hegel, we can use a specific example from his Science of Logic, where he lays out the concept of a universal and the concept of a particular. So this is, to map this onto your objection, there's the abstracta, the universals, and there's the concreta, the particulars. And so if we think of these as a thesis and an antithesis, if we try to understand the universal out of itself, we arrive at the antithesis that is a particular being the opposite of a universal. And the interplay of these ideas help us understand the concept of individual. So the individual is a particular, has universal rights. So by understanding the individual, we can understand how we come to knowledge of universal. So it's this interplay of understanding the concepts of universal, something out of itself, and then the understanding of something particular in itself that helps us understand these things in and for themselves. And that's how we come to the knowledge of something like individual. So another worry you laid out is, well, how do we know, you have this rule book, well, why don't we just pick some other rule book? Why this rule book rather than some other? Part of that answer is going to lay in the nature of the Hegelian dialectic, nature of the moral argument. Well, why shouldn't we have slaves? Why should we? Why can't we keep slaves? Dialectic has moved beyond that. It's part of we've come to the knowledge that slavery is wrong. So we have to then, in order to meet this objection of, well, what if we're just objects are not moral truths, but just mere preferences? Yes, the idea that this is Nietzsche's concern, is that really what it is just the vying of power of different preferences in certain time periods. And so I think that's an objection that has to be met. And so I will try to meet that with what I can call here the agony argument. So the agony argument suggests that the nature of pain, or the nature of agony, gives us a reason, or counts in favor of us wanting to avoid it. Now, if we are not robust realists about reasons, any other view is not going to have that implication. I think that's super implausible. So what do I mean by that? I mean that if you took someone who had the preference of wanting to hold their hand over a stove, or someone who had the preference of trying to eat a car, I think that these are in themselves irrational preferences. They are contrary to reason. And that because there is a fact that we should, ought, or must try to avoid future pain, because that sort of fact obtains, that's what allows us to make the claim that someone who does have the actual preference to want to eat a car or to hold their hand over a hot stove is acting irrational, acting contrary to reason. That if we deny that we have this categorical reason to want to avoid future pain, then we have the unacceptable implication that we would have to admit if someone had the preference to want to hold their hand over a hot stove or to want to try to eat a car, to want agony for its own sake, we would have to admit that that person is acting rationally. That to me is just an absurd implication. It is probably one of the strongest reasons that pushes me towards this holistic, non-naturalist view of just rationality in general, because there's just certain things that just to me seem like there's no way, like if we're going to have this thing called reason and it's going to help us be more rational, it cannot have these implications.
Yeah, there's definitely some good stuff there that I agree with. I'm gonna have to steal your phrase, eat a car. That's great. I like that.
I borrowed it from Derek Parfit, so just
Nice. Yeah, I'm definitely taking that one. Okay, so I think to some extent we've actually moved from one objection to a new epistemological one. So from my point of view, I think there's the metaphysical concern of vacuity, the emptiness objection, that like we're not really saying anything meaningful or substantive when we say this is good or that is bad, because all we have are ununifiable particular claims. We have no concept that we can cash out that unifies them. It seems that on my view, from a Christian perspective, there's this God who has a particular beauty about him that you can spell out in specific terms, and that is historically discoverable. It seems that it's in some sense kind of friendly to a dialectical movement, and that human beings are as a race gaining more experience of God as our race continues on. To know moral facts is to have some kind of inkling what God is like. So it seems there like we have a unifying concept. And I'll just, leaving that behind, give you space there if you want to say anything about that. But as far as the,
I would just so that it's clear for the listeners. So I would try to unify all these by the irreducibly normative concept of a reason, and then I would say that it's not vacuous, because claims like we should want to avoid future pain, that's a substantive claim. That's not a trivial claim. That's not true by definition. It's something we could argue with. I realize that the contrary seems absurd, that we should ought or want pain for its own sake. That's what leads me to this view. Go ahead.
Okay, so I also don't want to jump the gun. So if you have an objection to my view, feel free to jump in. But as far as this epistemological problem, what I would respectfully push back is I think this is really a very sophisticated disguise for subjectivism, because I think when you say things like when we consider pain, and there's no way to conceive of it being rational for someone to desire being in pain. The issue to me seems to be that you could simply say that's, there doesn't seem to be any let me put it this way. When you make those comments, it seems that one can interpret them to inform us about your personal preferences without need to add any more content to what you're saying. So if you were to say something like, I prefer not to be in pain, and maybe it can be proven, I don't think it can, that people prefer for the human race in general not to be in pain, then you have something like a universal preference. But even then, I think that would at best get you to some kind of constructivist morality, where morality is really just kind of a shared fable that people had. They have this story about how we are all unified by this preference in society not to cause each other pain, so let's not do it. But that doesn't actually make it an extramental fact or state of affairs that people have a reason not to be in pain. So I guess there I would just wonder, like, how does one justify the belief that we have a reason to avoid pain in ourselves or for others, or however you would like to reinterpret that?
I would. So I think the best move for me here is to try to turn the tables on this objection. To say that my view is an objectivist view, and that either my view is right or some form of nihilism is right. That's a very, very, very strong claim. I realize, because what I want to, why the reason why I say that is that my view is the one that is insisting that what is morally relevant or what is of normative significance is in the object. So when I say that we should want, is in the object of our judgment, I should say that, we should want to avoid future pain and agony. I'm not saying something about any subject. I'm saying something about pain and agony. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's not saying anything about a subject. There's no subjective characteristic that makes that true. But now, let's contrast this with your view. This is how I'm going to try to turn the tables. On your view, we do have to make reference to a subjective characteristic. God's nature, God's commands, man's nature, and the relation that exists between these subjects. So those are part of the judgment that something is good. But it is a subjective characteristic. That is what makes a moral claim true on your view. And so I'm trying to avoid that. That's one of the reasons why I'm a non-naturalist, is I'm trying to avoid all of these subjective characteristics. That would be indicative of something like a constructivist view too. What I want to say is that no, what is normatively important is found in the object of our judgment, and whether or not that is true or false is independent of any subjective characteristic, including God's attitudes, responses, including human attitudes and responses, including alien human and responses. I don't have to distinguish between these different types of subjects. I'm talking about morality, because morality is independent of any subject. That's how I would try to turn the tables.
Okay. There are two. Well, let me say three things, and I'll try to be brief. It's hard to say all three of them and be brief, but I'll try. The first one is that I guess I don't think it's useful. I don't think it's illegitimate, but I don't think it's useful to use the terms subjective and objective in the way that you do. But for the sake of charity, I think I would just bite the bullet and say I don't think it's problematic for morality to be subject to an omniscient, all-powerful, sovereign Lord who creates and cares for the universe and reigns over it with perfect justice, aimed at a cosmic conclusion of grace and final judgment. That seems to me not problematic. It seems to me that the entire reason why subjectivism is problematic in the first place is because it makes fallible, not wise, not in control, illegitimate agents equivocated with knowledge or truth or something like that. Like for me, as someone who can have false beliefs, it would just be silly that to say my beliefs are identical with knowledge, or that my beliefs are a sufficient condition of knowledge, or something like that. But that kind of objection just doesn't apply to a being whose thoughts determine everything about reality. So I think I would just bite that bullet and shrug and say, I don't think that's really a problem that my view faces. The second thing I would say is that I think I wonder about this description of the moral fact being in the object. That is, it's a property of the object, irrelative to surveyors, because that would mean that it's true even of a rock that it ought not to seek pain. And I don't know what it means to say, a non-moral agent is obligated to avoid pain, right? It seems to me that these facts pertain only to moral agents and are therefore, in some sense, contingent upon the concrete natures of creatures in the universe. I don't think you would disagree with that, but I also think you would change that in some way that will. The reason I'm putting that forward is I think you'll give some clarification as to why or how you.
Sure. So my starting point is to be Aristotle here and say, man is a rational animal. So obviously this applies to humans because we're rational beings, and it might apply to other rational beings. And rocks just are not other rational beings. So while there are still normative truths, just rocks aren't the sort of things that can have that kind of knowledge because they just don't have the cognitive capacities to do that. And so can distinguish here between moral agents and non-moral agents. And so moral agents are the ones that have the capacity to appreciate these truths. So if a small child comes in and rips up all the books out of someone's library, we're not going to hold them morally responsible for that because they just didn't understand the morality of their action. But if an adult did that, would. And so there's a distinction here between someone who's a moral agent and who's not a moral agent. Now we can make a further distinction between a moral agent and a moral patient, where a moral agent is someone who can understand moral obligations and the significance of their moral actions, whereas a moral patient can't, but they can still be the beneficiaries of a moral obligation or a moral act. So again, to use a child as an example, they might not be moral agents, they are capable of being harmed. Or our pets. Our pets might be a better example here. They do have a moral value. They can be harmed in a way that we can appreciate that we should not harm them. We should not treat them that way. And so by distinguishing between moral agents and non-moral agents, and then further between moral agents and moral patients, I don't think any significant problems arise.
Okay, so I'll put that aside just for now because there's another objection I want to make regarding the subjective-objective distinction, but save that for later if we have time. The third response I want to make about your turning the tables is this, that it seems to me, it seems to me that my option just makes that argument a false dichotomy. That I on the one hand, I think practically speaking, nihilism and ethical non-naturalism are indistinguishable because on nihilism, there's no way to know, for the very reason that there are just no facts to know, or maybe you're non-cognitivist or something like that, but there's no way to know moral facts. And it seems like on this view too, there's no way to know moral facts even if they did exist, because all we can appeal to is our preferences. It seems that my view and other Christian models like it is exactly the third alternative, that look, there's this God who has designed human faculties to have sort of an intuitive awareness about moral characteristics, and who has given verbal commendation of a certain way of life, and who reigns the cosmos in a certain way that has historical appeal to to the story that God is telling through it. So it seems to me that view gives you an extra mental bridge between the subject and the moral object, even if you think the moral object is itself subjective in that it's subject to the God who creates it.
So I would only, for the sake of brevity, I would the way I would push back is again to Hegel here. When you say that we would we wouldn't have knowledge. Again, I totally admit that there's an epistemological objection here that's worth answering. I mean, how do we have knowledge of these moral facts? But the way you characterized it is that we only have access to our preferences. So when I hear that to me seems like you're only admitting of one part of the Hegelian dialectic. We can only understand something in itself. We can't understand something out of itself, nor could we understand the relation of those so that we could understand a world in and for itself. So I would just say that that's clearly false. We can clearly understand abstract and universal concepts in themselves, out of themselves, and in and for themselves. And then I gave the example earlier of how we can understand the concept of universal in itself, and then we can understand the concept of a particular out of itself, and then we can understand, we can combine those to understand the world in and for itself in our concept of the individual, a particular person with universal rights.
Suppose we think of this in terms of. I'm gonna press back at you apologies for being spunky, but suppose that we think of this in terms of a regress problem, right? So you might enlist appeal to the irrationality of seeking pain needlessly, or something like that, or not avoiding pain, or however you wish to put it. Then the question can become, right, why are we justified in believing that? What would your response be?
So you would have to then apply to some things would be intrinsically justified. So this is a question of foundationalism or coherence. So where does justification come to an end? How do we resolve any further disagreement? And so in metaethics, we're just going to have to say what the implications of the theories are. And so if two people disagree over some truth and we're objectivists, then one of them is closer to the truth than the other. And so then we would have to do further dialectical or argument in order to figure out where it is, which side is making the mistake, which side is closer to the truth than the other. And so, but then you raise an even deeper question of, well, when does that justification come to an end? When can we say, okay, well, this is what's intrinsically justifying. If we deviate from this, that's when we're making the mistake. That's a very difficult question. That's what, I lean towards a foundationalist view, though I am sympathetic to coherentist and pragmatic theories here, where maybe these different theories are methods that are climbing the same mountain from different sides. They can understand a justification, how some justification might be foundational, and we can understand that by how it coherently fits with everything else, kind of like what we were doing with simplicity earlier, and how things can be unified and coherently see how they fit together. Or we can see the pragmatics of it. We can see how they actually play out in a dialectical, and how certain ideas are just more useful than others. So when I gave the example of having the preference of wanting to eat a car, that helped us understand the point that I was trying to make better than if I had used some other example. And so that's a pragmatic use of that concept. It helps us understand something deeper. And so perhaps we should have another discussion about epistemology, because I feel like we could get into something very, very, very deep into, well, where do these justifications come to an end? It is a very, very interesting epistemological question.
Yeah, for sure. I guess I would maintain that I remember in your commentary with it's Cody, right? I think I'm getting that right. Corey, that's right. Sorry, my bad. You made I caught the phrase, and I thought, wow, I think that's a really great way to put it. That at some point you just have to take these moral beliefs for granted, and I thought that immediately, right? Oh, that's foundationalism. But I think that's sort of that's exactly my objection here, is that, well, the problem that runs into is that just is an example of subjectivism. That's just a way of saying, when we follow our justifications back, we eventually run down into beliefs that we can't justify. We just have to assume them. But to say that we just have to assume them, and maybe you meant something different by that, and so
yeah, I think so. It's not that we just have to assume them. It's that they are the bedrock. They are, as if we're thinking of an analogy of digging a hole. This is where we hit the bedrock. there isn't something deeper than this. That's just where justification comes to an end. It's not that we have to simply assume it. And we might do that for the sake of argument to then run a reductio ad absurdum, and this is part of the dialectic of how we come to the knowledge of these. Sure, that might be the case, but what I'm trying to articulate there is that truths are primitive; they're basic. So if I lay out some basic truth of mathematics, it's not that I just assume that basic truth of mathematics. It's just that's the foundational truth of mathematics. That's where, if we were digging for this truth, we've hit bedrock. This is where justification comes to an end. And I do not pretend to have settled all the questions of where justification comes to an end.
For sure. Yeah, I don't think anybody has, but certainly not myself. But I think I want to press you maybe one last time and just say, well, I think that strategy of saying, this is bedrock and therefore it's legitimate to stop here, just legitimizes the same strategy against it. And that, to me, is exactly the same thing as subjectivism. I mean, the problem with subjectivism is that when someone says something like, I believe X, and that is a sufficient condition of it being knowledge, I believe X, therefore I know X. The problem is somebody else can say, well, I believe not X, and therefore I know not X. And there's no way to adjudicate between those two, because the principle legitimizing the one legitimizes the other. And so
can adjudicate between the two of them by argument. So just like what we're doing right now, we would then say, okay, let's assume you're right, and let's assume I'm right, and let's see what follows from that.
Yeah.
So that's a coherentist approach.
Well, so what I would say is that I don't think that that's admitting the legitimacy. I think that's saying, since because that whole unavailability of adjudication would be a problem, therefore it's just not legitimate to claim bedrock, and you have to do the hard work of arguing about these things in order to present a justified case. So it seems to me that is just to grant what I'm saying and say, look, we cannot say we've hit bedrock, we just have to take these things for granted. This is where the justifications stop. What I would say is that I don't have a problem on the face of it saying that there's something like intrinsic justification. But there, I think I would just challenge you to show that there's something intrinsically justifying about pain or something like that. It seems to me that, like, if somebody says something like, look, there's this God, and he's come down in the flesh, and he speaks with perfect wisdom and perfect deity to creatures whose psychology he's designed from top to bottom, with the intent that they will recognize who he is. It seems to me there you have intrinsic justification. It's impossible to be mistaken or fail to recognize who Jesus is in that situation, because he has all the conditions required to cause you to know that. But when we consider the concept of pain, there just is nothing about it that would make us expect belief, much less knowledge, that it's just intrinsically wrong, right? Nothing about pain explains why we would know that pain is something we should avoid.
So I would push back here, and so in the theme of intrinsically justifying, so I could appeal to something like a principle of phenomenal conservatism that says, things are the way they appear in the absence of some sort of defeater. And so I would say that the nature of pain, what it is like to be in pain, when we remember what it is like to be in pain, experience the nature of pain, it does seem like it's the sort of thing that counts in favor of us wanting to avoid. I do think that's the case. I think there is something about pain, and we reflect on the nature of pain. There is something about it. It seems like it counts in favor of us wanting to avoid it. That we do not have any defeaters for that. There is no defeater that would say, no. It's actually the case that we should want pain for its own sake. We should want to put our hands over a hot stove just for the sake of having our hand on a hot stove. And so I think we can say that the nature of pain is intrinsically justifying in the sense that we have this normative reason to want to avoid it for its own sake.
I want the listeners to appreciate the irony here, because I not only agree that ceteris paribus, all things being equal, you should avoid pain, but I even agree that I think it's irrational, all things being equal, not to avoid pain, especially causing it to others. But I don't think you would consider it legitimate, Ben, for someone to say, well, I don't know what it is about Christianity that allows it to succeed with this phenomenal conservatism. It just seems to everyone that Christianity is true. So unless I have a defeater for that view, it's justified. I think you're going to immediately produce a defeater, and I don't think the defeater you produce is going to be of significant uniqueness such that I can't use that same defeater against the claim that pain inherently seems to be wrong.
So I think that to use theism as the example, you could offer something like the problem of evil, an argument from evil, and that would be a reason to doubt the truth of theism. However, I don't think there is a similar argument from evil or argument from pain that would be a defeater for the claim that we should want to avoid pain for its own sake. I don't think such an argument exists. I'm open to such an argument. I'm not aware of any.
Okay, let me first say that I 100% agree. We should definitely come back and discuss epistemology, because
philosophy's never. That's the beauty of it.
I mean, when you jump into the middle of the pool, it just keeps expanding. So yeah, I'm totally with you on this. And I mean, already here, there have been so many things. Like one thing I keep forgetting to mention, but I wanted to agree with you on it, or I wanted to point it out, is that, I do agree with you here, perhaps, depending on how you define it, that there are certain of these truths, perhaps like pain or like good. I think good is that's something I'm staunchly in agreement with you about, that are primitive concepts. But I think we would disagree about whether or not primitive concepts cannot be cashed out in non-trivial or non-tautological terms. And there I think that's kind of an epistemological difference, perhaps.
Yeah, we should definitely, because that would take us into Moore's open question argument.
Yes.
I think that would, I'm with you. I think that'd be a really good conversation.
Cool. Okay, let me just, I don't know how much time you have.
Should probably be wrapping it up here. I know that I'm going to be a baby.
To be clear,
do you mind if I give you one last consideration?
I laid out my view at the start, so I had the first word. So why don't you go ahead and give the last word in a closing.
Okay. Maybe we can come back to this. I feel bad, but sorry, what did you say?
I said, I don't feel bad.
Okay, well, I really appreciate your candor, Ben, and I'm glad that we got to have this discussion. I hope we have more discussions like these in the future.
For sure.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess one concern that I wanted to get to, but there's just, like you said, there's just too many things, is it seems to me that, like with Plato, like with Plotinus, so also with Hegel, who I think is maybe like the supreme version of Platonism, it seems to me that you run into a sort of fatalism with these norms, because considered in themselves, when we think about what you're talking about when you say like a fact in favor of, that's really something kind of like logical implication. But the problem with logical implication is that it's not necessarily, depends on your metaphysic, it's not necessarily motivating. So what that's to say is that this concept of norms doesn't include motivation. It doesn't mean that human beings care about these norms. And so you can imagine that there is some argument, for example, that the sky is blue. And you can also imagine that society has developed such technology that they don't even go outside, don't even look at the sky anymore. They just don't care that there's a fantastic argument that the sky is blue. They don't care to believe that the sky is blue. It doesn't motivate them, even though I think we would agree they're obliged in some sense to think so. And so this creates a tension here that it's not sufficient for your meta ethic to provide mere implicative facts like that. You ought to, that there's a reason to act in a certain way. For example, it has to be a motivating fact. People have to actually care about being good people. But it seems to me that looking at the story of history, we would expect exactly the opposite. I mean, human beings are just as cousins of apes, animals that are very friendly toward raping and pillaging. The story of humanity is a very sordid tale of empires building up, practicing imperialism, imploding because of rebellious arsonists, or expanding to the point where they just become rotten hives of villainy. The story of humanity is actually a very dark one. And furthermore, on our best scientific theories from a naturalist perspective, the universe is going to blow up. It'll die of a heat death, or it'll become cold, or whatever. Humanity is not going to last. It doesn't have some kind of end, cosmic justice, utopia, etc. And it seems to me that the nature of motivations is that they're teleological in nature. We're motivated by goals. We're not motivated by mere laws. The laws motivate us because they're in pursuit, perhaps of some ideal. Perhaps goodness itself motivates us. But even that would count as a teleological end, that we want to see goodness manifest historically in the world. So if we have no reason to expect that that's where the world's heading, and if we have no reason to expect that human beings have some unique capability to care about and pursue good, which I would argue from a naturalist perspective we have no reason to expect, it seems to me that these moral facts are at best just cold, logical facts of reality that have no bearing on us. I mean, you might as well just drink, be merry, and follow the wisdom of the Koheleth and Ecclesiastes, who speaks from the kind of viewpoint of a nihilist and says, don't be too good, don't be too evil, be a perfect balance, because you don't want to end your life by just being a perfect saint. And you got to preserve your goodness by doing a few bad things to other people. It seems to me like that's the kind of motivations you end up with in that and an ethical non-naturalist worldview.
This is a great discussion. I want to thank for inviting me.
Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on, Ben. I'm sorry that I wish we could talk more, but I know your time is constrained. So
I think we got some really good stuff. There's a lot of material, a lot of good stuff for people to listen to, and I definitely think we should set up something again to another one. That way, it's not a 3-hour-long discussion for people.
Let's do it, brother. Congratulations on your child. That's awesome.
Oh, thanks so much. We are super stoked.
Yeah. I'm glad you're not a nihilist in your raising. There we can say cheers to that. We can both agree on that. All right, Ben. Well, you have a good one. I guess Chase, you're wrapping up.
Hello, I'm here. Sorry, my dogs are barking.
What's up, bro? Did you
job today, didn't you, Chase?
What?
A pretty easy moderating job today.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to YouTube, I just sit here, hang out, listen, not understand half of it, but still enjoy it.
Yeah, but when I heard you were a friend of Tyler, I was like, oh man, that I already know that you're incredibly nice and gracious to people on your podcast. So that was the cherry on top. I was like, oh yeah, okay, this guy's gonna be super cool.
Yeah, Tyler and I've been pretty good friends now for probably about 4 years. So he's definitely been giving me some advice for baby stuff.
Nice.
All right, y'all. Well, I'm gonna have to take off. But once again, thanks for inviting me. And let's set up something soon.